everyone. How are we doing today? We're doing good? Can we have a round of applause for the speakers we've heard so far today? Yeah. Well, December is one of my favorite months of the year. There's so much anticipation and bustling and warmth with the lights and decorations and songs on the radio. Although I enjoy December, it's always a little awkward for me because I don't celebrate Christmas. I'm Jewish. Born and raised by parents who grew up in the Brooklyn section of New York. And so I've never really known what to do when people come up to me and say, "Merry Christmas," and they give me Christmas cards. So do I say thank you and appreciate the intent? Or do I tell them I'm Jewish, which usually prompts one of three reactions. So one reaction is kind of this awkward apology. "Oh, sorry, didn't know you were Jewish." Sometimes I get undeserved praise. "You're Jewish? That's awesome. Good for you." And then sometimes there's this Kevin Bacon game type situation. "Oh my God, my great-grandfather's Jewish. Larry Steinberger, maybe you know him." Because I know all the Jewish people across the entire United States. So I share this story as a small example of what it feels like to be in the out-group, a term used by social psychologists to refer to the people in the margins. So it's kind of like the world celebrating at one big party, but I wasn't invited. And I'm sure you've all had that experience at some point. Moments when you don't fit in, where you don't conform to what is considered normal. But what exactly is normal? Sometimes it feels like we're chasing some kind of one-size-fits-all prescription of how we should act, should look, should do, or should say. And sociologists would refer to that as social norms, expectations set up by society. Now, if you think about people with physical disabilities, they often literally can't fit into society's social norms. So if you picture a typical day in your life, from getting up in the morning, to going through all of your daily activities, to going to sleep at night. Now make a mental list of what would be different if you were in a wheelchair, starting with getting up out of bed, using the bathroom, taking a shower, brushing your teeth, getting dressed, and eating breakfast. And that would just be the first hour of your day. Many of us would need completely different homes, ones that are all one story, with wider door frames and shelves and counters that are lowered so we could reach them. Consider your transportation. How would you get to work or to the store? And how much longer would your daily activities take you, and how would you build that into your schedule? So the point here is that society is not set up for people with physical disabilities. The physical world expects that we walk on 2 feet, see with our eyes, hear with our ears, talk with our mouth, and use our arms to talk and text and eat. And so if one of our 5 senses or a body part is not working, then it's considered a disability. But consider our language, a disability. So that's an ability that should be there, but isn't. And I've often asked my students to define disability. And sometimes they use words such as limitation or impairment. So we believe that a disability means that something is broken and needs to be fixed. But what if it can't be fixed? Or in some cases, is there anything broken to begin with? So 4 years ago, I had my students interview individuals with physical disabilities, including deafness, blindness, spinal cord injury, stroke, spina bifida, stuttering, and more. I called this the Voices Project because the purpose was for my students to capture the voice of another person and write a memoir of their life from the first-person perspective. Some of the stories illustrated very painful moments of discrimination, such as a girl who watched her future employer throw her job application in the trash because she limped, or a boy with spina bifida who was kicked in the ankle by a school bully until his ankle broke. Other stories reflected beautiful moments of humanity, such as a girl who stood by her father's side as he worked to regain his speech after a sudden stroke, or a deaf man who went to Gallaudet University and felt like his life was limitless. Now, the students that struggled the most with this assignment were the ones who interviewed someone with a story in the middle, someone who led what most would consider to be a typical life. So one of my students interviewed a man with arthrogryposis, and that's a medical condition from birth that results in a short stature and fragile bones and often requires the use of a wheelchair for life. Now, the man that was interviewed was very content. He had a job, he had friends, he lived independently with the help of medical assistance and transportation. And so my student came to me and said, Dr. Nordstrom, I don't know what to write because the guy doesn't have any problems. And I could almost see his mental confusion. So wait a minute, a guy who has been in a wheelchair his whole life, how could he be so happy? And to me, this captures one of the stereotypes of people with physical disabilities. So from the vantage point of the abled, it's assumed those who are disabled are inherently unhappy with their life because their bodies are holding them back. And this is a stereotype because while it may be true for some people with a physical disability, it certainly is not true for all. Now, this stereotype was broken for me when I went to college at the University of Rochester in upstate New York. And that's a city that has one of the largest populations of deaf persons in the country. So I took 3 years of American Sign Language and was taught by all deaf instructors who spelled deaf with a capital D because they were proud to be deaf. And they reminded us as hearing students we were not allowed to use our voice in the classroom. And they would use this sign, which meant turn off your voice. So we could only use our eyes and sign language to communicate so we could experience deaf culture. And it was through those instructors that I learned about the resistance of deaf persons to cochlear implants. Because in their minds, nothing was broken that needed to be fixed. They loved their language, they loved their culture, so nothing was missing. Stereotypes have a very insidious nature. They're kind of like mental viruses that contaminate our perceptions, which is why we need to understand how they work and get control of them before they blossom into prejudice and discrimination. So how do we do this? Well, as a college professor, I made it my mission several years ago to teach my students how to recognize, analyze, and challenge their stereotypes. And that's how the Voices Project was born. Now, I described to you the second version about physical disability, but the original version actually occurred 3 years earlier and created quite a stir with my students when I told them that they were going to interview someone from a group that they disliked. And I got this idea from contact theory, which emerged in 1954 by a social psychologist named Gordon Allport. So Allport did an experiment where he brought people from antagonistic groups together under conditions of cooperation and equality. And he found that direct intergroup contact reduced prejudice for both groups. The same results have been replicated across the world for 50 years, even in countries that have very high levels of interpersonal conflict. So I thought the best way to combat stereotypes would be for my students to create their own attitudes based on real life experience with a real person instead of relying on second or third-hand information from the media or friends or family. So for the original version of the Voices Project, I had 30 Intro to Psychology students pair up and interview someone from a stigmatized group, such as Muslims, Asians, Blacks, Hispanics, people in poverty, people with AIDS, people with obesity, gays, and lesbians. My students met with their interviewee for a few times and then wrote a memoir of the person's life from the first-person perspective. My students also completed attitude surveys during the first and last week of the semester and then 1 year later. So when I looked at the data on the racial groups, I found that students who completed the Voices Project had significant reductions in racism compared to students from a separate semester that didn't do the project. So on one hand, the researcher in me was really excited to see that the project and direct contact helped my students' attitudes. But the teacher in me was very disappointed because just standing up in front of the class teaching about stereotypes and prejudice didn't seem to affect my students' attitudes at all. So what I learned from both versions of the Voices Project is that direct contact is one of the strongest weapons we have to prevent and challenge stereotypes. Something happens when you build a relationship with someone, no matter how brief. The closer you get to someone, the more you see the complexity of their identity, and the distinction between normal and different becomes irrelevant. There is no different because, by definition, we're all different. So shouldn't different be our new normal? And I think physical disability is a great example of this. All of us in this room have had a physical or health condition. At the very least, most of us have some kind of a sight-enhancing device, like glasses or contacts. Many of us have had broken bones, chronic illnesses, like asthma or diabetes, and many of us have had cancer. There is no way to exit life without experiencing a physical disability. So if a disability is something that everyone will experience, shouldn't a disability be considered normal? Now, I realize that letting go of our social norms and our expectations does not come naturally to us. The need for predictability and for social belonging is just part of human nature. Those of us who fit well into society will want to keep things status quo because it's working for us, until one of our out-group characteristics bubbles up to the surface and reminds us how bad it feels to be alone on the outside. Related to this is our preference for the familiar, which social psychologist Robert Zients calls the mere exposure effect. 5 decades of research have supported this notion that the more we encounter a stimulus, whether it's food or people or art, the more we like it and will continue to like it in the future. So if we put all of this together, it means that our stereotypes and social norms are not going to change themselves. When December rolls around, I'm going to get lots of Christmas greetings and Christmas cards, like I always do. But 2 things have changed. So first, I've just started to out myself. So I just tell people I'm Jewish, and what happens is that starts a conversation where I could share a part of myself and begin to talk about my religious traditions and my religious culture. And when I started to do that, something beautiful happened. Now, I teach at a Catholic university founded and sponsored by the Sisters of Mercy. And when the sisters found out that I was Jewish, they began to send me blessings for my holidays. And they began to have campus-wide celebrations that included Jewish holidays. And the power of that recognition and that validation of being seen for who you really are is one of the greatest gifts that we can give to each other. And my experience has taught me that I too make assumptions about other people, just like they make assumptions about me. So the second thing I changed was to ask my students what were they doing over winter break and if they were celebrating any holidays. And I based my well wishes on what they told me. And just like my students realized when they did the interviews for the Voices Project, everyone has a story. And we can't assume that we know somebody's story based upon how similar or different they seem to us. So to me, a society without stereotypes is a society without assumptions. It's a society in which everyone's story can be listened to without judgment. It's a place where we could be valued for our difference instead of our conformity. And we can create this society because we are the ones that write the social rules. So let's create an environment that includes as many people as possible so that everybody wins. You can do it, and we could do it together. One person, one story at a time. Thank you.